Okay, calm down. You got rivers, man. You got rivers, man. Okay, calm down.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Katie Halper Show. I am, as you know, Katie Halper. Very excited to be here talking about some really interesting things that we honestly haven't spoken about enough recently, and that is Latin America, immigration, the so-called war on drugs. And we have a really expert panel to guide us through these challenging issues. And that panel will be, first, we will be talking to Andalusia Soloff, as well as José Luis Granados Ceja. In the second half, we'll be talking to Yale professor historian Greg Grandin. But before I bring on Andalusia and José Luis, let me just encourage everyone to, as always, like the stream, give it a thumbs up. Also, please subscribe if you haven't already subscribed. We're almost at 250,000, which would be great. So just press subscribe and then the bell. If you can become Patreon supporters, please do that at patreon.com/The Katie Halper Show. Again, that's patreon.com/The Katie Halper Show. And if you do that, you get great things like early access to an interview that's over an hour long with Walsh, Joan, the great playwright, essayist, writer, actor. And if you don't know who Walsh, Joan is from those things, he's the guy who says inconceivable in The Princess Bride. That's not his greatest achievement, but he is very well known for that. Brilliant guy. And we talk about Gaza, Israel, how he went from being a centrist to a leftist. And again, you'll get that in its fullness at patreon.com/The Katie Halper Show. And if you can afford that at $5, that's how you get the bonus content. If you can't afford that and you can just pay for $1 a month, we really appreciate that too. And that helps us make the show possible. Like, we just literally couldn't do the show without you and your Patreon support. So without any further ado, I'm going to just start the show. I'm going to bring on our first two guests. Very excited to be bringing back onto the show José Luis Granados Ceja, who is a writer and photojournalist based in Mexico City. He previously worked as a staff writer for Telesur and currently works on a freelance basis. He also is the host of the Soberanía podcast. And he is someone who talks and thinks a lot about politics and covers grassroots efforts to affect social change. And he often covers the work of social and labor movements in Latin America. And we are also bringing onto the stage Andalusia Soloff, who is an Emmy-nominated documentary filmmaker and multimedia journalist in Mexico. She has produced award-winning documentaries, including A Sense of Community, Ixtapala, Frontline Mexico, Guatemala's Past on Earth for Al Jazeera, as well as Endangered for HBO, which focuses on the risks that journalists face. Her new cinematic short, Poppy Crash, which flips the script on the fentanyl crisis, is part of the official selection of the Docs MX Film Festival and IDFA Docs for Sale. So let us bring onto the stage Andalusia and José Luis. Welcome.
Hello, it's really good to be here.
Yes, thanks for coming back. And thank you, Andalusia, for making your debut.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure. We've been, for a few months now, been trying to make it happen, and we finally did.
Yes. So things are looking up. Auspicious start to the show. So you guys are both based in Mexico. I want to start off the show by asking you if you could talk about the executive actions that Trump has taken, the executive orders that he's taken on immigration, on Latin America, on Mexico in particular.
Sure, I'll go first. Okay.
Sure.
I think when it comes to the U.S. policies, the first thing I always want to say is that Latin America has to deal with the fallout, right? A lot of times it seems like a lot of pressure is put on the region to respond, and obviously it should respond in a way that protects human rights, which hasn't always been true, that protects human dignity. I think the episode with Colombia was a good example of a president standing up for the human dignity, the human rights of migrants. But obviously this is all coming as a result of the election result in the United States, although arguably migration policies don't actually vary that much. It's just some of the rhetoric and some of the more aggressive implementation policies that we've seen. And so in the case of Mexico, what we've seen is a very difficult negotiating situation. It seems to me that what Trump wants is to offload the responsibility of his mass deportation plans onto other countries. So there is tremendous pressure on Mexico to accept migrant protection protocols, that awful euphemism for remain in Mexico, which was very, very hard on migrants. I mean, mean, there's a lot of documentation about the impact that migrant protection protocols had in terms of actually being able to access asylum for asylum seekers. And of course, it's a very complicated, violent situation in the border region. They were susceptible to abuse by state and non-state actors consistently. And so even then, even if Mexico ultimately agrees to that, that's going to be produce a negative situation for migrants. But I think the real worry for me anyway is this interest that Trump has in actually deporting non-Mexicans to Mexico so that Mexico takes care of the diplomatic negotiations to return them to their countries of origin. And I say this because, you know, who are the major groups that have come? Who are the ones that are now paying the price of the canceling of the parole program? Well, it's Cubans, it's Venezuelans, it's Nicaraguans. It's people from countries that have a very strained relationship with the United States as a result of US imperialism and interventions in their countries. And so, you know, why should Venezuela make it easy for Trump to deport citizens to Venezuela? Obviously, Venezuela has its own kind of programs to receive them. It's not about, you know, not wanting them. But I do think that what Trump is trying to do is take that decision out of their hands, offload it to Mexico. And I think it's very important that Mexico resists this because, you know, here in Mexico, we're living this political process. It's called the fourth transformation of Mexico. And a big part of that is the defense of sovereignty. And oddly enough, what Mexico needs to do here to stand up for sovereignty in the region is actually not accept any kind of deal from the Trump administration that would lead to them having to be the ones to responsible for the deportation, repatriation of people who are being deported from the United States, so that Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, Haiti have a stronger bargaining chip in order to say, okay, but you actually, why don't you lift sanctions, end the blockade of Cuba, and then we can talk about, you know, negotiating, you know, these deportation flights. And so I think that's the key thing right now. Mexico needs to, you know, to use this language that's often used in international relations, draw a red line and say no. I expect that they will accept migrant protection protocols. It kind of sounds like the State Department is already proceeding as if that agreement has been made. It's not clear if it has been explicitly so, but I do think even then, you know, Mexico should try to resist that. If it doesn't, definitely not accepting non-Mexican nationals the way that it previously did, say, under Title 42. Obviously, these are very different circumstances. And I do think that Mexico is in a really good bargaining position in the sense that, you know, this is a government that has a lot of support, and I think understands that if it calls on the population to back them, they will see that turnout and see that strength that gives them from having popular support in these negotiations with Trump, which stands in contrast to, say, Canada, for example, which is in a much weaker position.
Right.
Yes, I think basically what we've seen since Trump has been making all of these ridiculous threats to Mexico and to Latin America and to migrants everywhere is a very measured response from Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum. She speaks in like a very, I don't want to say subdued because she says very strong things, but she speaks in a very calm fashion, you know? So she like makes that Trump says, okay, we're going to rename the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America or Gulf of the United States. I can't remember which one, Gulf of America, right? But and she's like, okay, you know, I found this map and it says maybe we can name the United States American Mexican, or because that's what it said, you know, back in the day. And then I saw today actually that Google now is saying that if you look the Gulf of Mexico, that it will say now the Gulf of America. I tried it. It doesn't say it, but it says it's only going to be within the United States. But I think that was like a first shows a lot of what her response to the things that he says is. And she, I mean, she was not invited to his inauguration. And when they asked her about it, she has a morning presser every single morning. And she was like, well, it's okay. I'm not going, but our ambassador will go. There's other representatives that will go, instead of making it like a big deal that she was not invited. And then she is really focused on these different programs that are a collaboration between many different Mexican government agencies to receive Mexican migrants who will be returned to Mexico under these mass deportations, you know, and it's the numbers. I mean, Trump has promised these million migrants that will be deported. While the numbers, it's horrible to see that there are hundreds of people that are being deported, but I think it's the numbers like 2,700 people would have to be deported every single day so that he would actually reach a million people deported in the time frame that he had said. So that is definitely not happening. I would like to comment on what happened the first day that he took office that everyone knows that it was a barrage of executive orders. Ironically, of course, freeing 1,500 people who had serious crimes committed, including assault on officers, and then saying that he needs to deport the criminals. I think the irony is not lost, of course, on the people who watch this program or the people in Mexico who follow these policies. But one of the things that he did and allegedly happened before he had even finished his speech was make that the CBP-1 application stopped working. The CB1 application was something that was implemented during the Joe Biden administration that allowed for migrants that were traveling to the United States hoping to request asylum. It allowed them to make appointments for asylum and then not wait on border cities, which often are more dangerous in Mexico, as there are many criminal organizations that prey on these migrants. And so these migrants were then able to stay at shelters in Chiapas, at shelters in Mexico City, at shelters along the way. I did a report a few months ago interviewing people from different countries in Africa, from Afghanistan, from Venezuela, from El Salvador, that were all at this shelter, Casa Tochan, here in Mexico City, and they were all waiting for their appointments for CBP-1. And I think over 800,000 people were able to enter the United States in an organized fashion, that they are entering when they already have their appointment. They are not entering illegally, as Donald Trump says. And it was a way for them to request asylum, which has been supposedly a long guaranteed right to people in the United States, that people that are fleeing from political repression, fleeing violence. There's a whole slew of things that make you qualified for asylum. And the CBP-1 app, which I heard José Luis talk about on his new podcast, Soberania. Congratulations on that. I think it's great that you have this new program. But talk about, of course, CBP-1 app was not great. It was not ideal, but it was a way that these migrants were being able to apply for asylum and in slightly less dangerous conditions. So there were thousands of people that were on the border that already had their appointment. Literally, there were people that had their appointment at 1 p.m. on January 20th, and then they were just canceled, so there was many different stories. And with these migrants on the border, I went to Casa Tochan here in Mexico City. I was able to interview activists there, but they had actually made a decision to not have the migrants had made a decision that they did not want to speak with the press that day because they were so devastated by the cancellation of this program. And so since then, now we've also seen, which doesn't affect so much as Mexico, but that the people that were in the process for applying for refugee status were, that's been canceled. People from Afghanistan that actually helped U.S. troops, and the whole refugee program is on hold, as CBP-1 is on hold. As so all of these, now the question is, well, maybe Mexico can help the migrants that were living in the United States integrate back into society in Mexico. Although there are often many different barriers to that. Often it's language, that they largely grew up in the United States. Sometimes it's documents, sometimes it's culture clash, sometimes it's security. There's a whole slew of challenges that they face. But the question also is, what will happen now with all the migrants that are no longer being able to enter the United States? Not just what José Luis is mentioning of those that may be deported and then think that Mexico will accept these Latin American or even from other countries, other regions around the world that are being deported by the United States, but what also is going to happen with all the migrants that are just in transit in Mexico, where there are hundreds of thousands of migrants that do pass through Mexico and now don't know what will happen. There are programs also to receive these migrants, and maybe that they will then and make Mexico home. We have seen over the past few years, especially in Mexico City. I myself live in a working class neighborhood in the center of the city, and increasingly you just hear people's accents that there are increasing numbers of migrants from Venezuela, from Colombia, and from Haiti that have integrated into Mexico City society. Some of them still have the hope of moving onto the U.S., and others are just happy to be here in Mexico.
José Luis, do you have anything you want to add to that? Any responses, any differences of opinions? Because the last time José Luis was on, where there was a little debate. So I'm looking forward to a potential debate on this, but maybe we haven't covered that area yet.
On this one, we're on the same page. But
Okay.
one thing I would add is that, of course, we understand the point is to be cruel. The point is to dissuade people. I remember Kamala Harris traveling to Guatemala and her message of do not come. And it's virtually the same from Donald Trump, which is just, we're going to make it really difficult. But the part that we always have to emphasize is that people are going to come anyway. And I appreciate Andalusia's point about the fact that, Mexico is still going to be the transit corridor because many people want to reach the United States. And even though they're obviously hearing this information that it's going to be more difficult, they're still going to make the journey. One of the things that we've seen is actually this policy here in Mexico of busing them back south and having them start all over again. Hopefully we can have a revision of that. It's obviously also aimed as a dissuasion tactic. But they're going to keep coming. What I always say is that people aren't migrating, and they'll tell you this, right? I'll never forget this. They're fleeing. They're fleeing poverty. They're fleeing violence. They're fleeing persecution. They're fleeing the consequences of U.S. intervention in Central America, right? And so there's this idea that, that this is a temporary thing or an emergency thing. I think also they need to abandon that and actually have a consistent amount of support being offered to everybody who finds themselves not just being returned, but in transit. I've been encouraged by the response of the Claudia Sheinbaum government, because one thing I've always said, again, right, we can't really do too much about the U.S. policies. We can obviously have the diplomatic conversations and try to pressure them, but ultimately the decision lies in Washington, not in Mexico City. But while they're in Mexico, we can spend the resources that this country does have to actually attend to their needs, to protect their human rights, which are often violated along the way by both state and non-state actors. And so what we've seen with people who are returning, integrating them to the social security programs, all the welfare programs, all these social programs that are guaranteed by the Constitution here in Mexico, offering them to them, even offering cash for them or for their immediate needs. That's very good. How can we also afford those kinds of protections and services to the migrants who are here on their way inside of the Mexican territory, so that the journey isn't as difficult? But obviously, there's going to be continued pressure from the United States to make it as difficult as possible. I think that's much of what the negotiation is happening. And in terms of what's actually going to happen now, without CBP1, like Andalusia said, they're going to largely kind of be in this limbo, right? What I expect is going to be what was before CBP1 became available to people migrating, is the metering. So basically at the border, the officials there decide how many they want to actually receive. But it's a very inefficient system, and it condemns people to being kind of trapped in these improvised camps, which are very, very difficult conditions, and that frankly, are not dignified of people. And I want to emphasize that, to go back, and maybe we can transition to other countries, right? I think what Gustavo Petro did was really good. He wasn't talking about, I'm not going to accept the deportation flights. The coverage in mainstream media has been awful, trying to say that, Donald Trump made him bend over and accept these conditions, right? All he was saying is treat them with dignity. You don't have to, put them in chains.
Can you set this up, because not everyone here follows or knows who Petro is, et cetera. Can you just set up this this very dynamic exchange that happened?
So Colombian President Gustavo Petro, who's actually the first leftist president elected in Colombia, comes from a guerrilla movement, the M19 movement, has largely positioned himself on the left of the spectrum here in Latin America. Decided to turn back 2 military planes that were carrying Colombian deportees into Colombia on the basis that they were, one, being transported on military planes, which was sort of out of protocol. Usually civilian planes are done. That's part of Trump's theater. It's actually cheaper to use civilian planes, but he wants to send this message. And they were shackled, right, in their ankles and by their hands. Many reported abusive treatment in the facilities before their deportation. And so he said, listen, we will accept them. They are Colombian nationals. It's not about that, but you have to treat them better. And of course, Trump's response was to fly off the handle, to immediately impose or threaten to impose 25% tariffs that would rise in a week to 50%, going after members of his government specifically, imposing visa restrictions and saying that Colombian products would be subject to more revisions, all this kind of stuff. And, eventually through diplomatic negotiations, that didn't come to pass. But the point I wanted to stress is that this is kind of, this is what's needed in the region. We need to have presidents like Gustavo Petro who say, you can't go this far with this. You have your agenda, but you can't treat people this way. And in contrast, we have people like Nayib Bukele, which I understand is actually in negotiations with the Trump administration to do what I said about
the president of El Salvador,
danger.
for those who don't know who he is.
Yes,
No,
president of El Salvador, Nayib Bukele, right? Far-right actor, very, very close to that kind of ideology that Trump espouses. And, he's suspended constitutional guarantees in his country for many, many months now, more than a year. Was illegally re-elected to office, violating the Constitution there. But all that to say is that so he built these mega prisons and has engaged in a mass detention campaign. And I think it's part of his efforts to cozy up to Trump is to be like, yeah, send him to El Salvador. And the one thing I always say is that, mass deportation may ultimately translate into mass detention, be it in the United States in concentration camps, and I do use that term deliberately, that's what they would be, or in these mega jails that Bukele is building. That's a terrifying prospect, right? And in the case of Central America, they have special laws. In fact, anybody from Central America generally ends up being accepted into it. And so they could be condemned. People from Guatemala, people from Honduras, could be in El Salvadorian jails as a result of these policies. And so it kind of gives you that contrasting picture of different responses from leaders in the region. Obviously, we know that where we stand here, which is that at the very least, protecting their human rights and human dignity.
And I think I want to add, because I'm sure José Luis did this in the interest of time, but I do want to go to the letter that Petro
sent. We have that. We can show that. Brad, let me know if you have it. If not, I have it open, and I mean,
he sent an amazing letter that was funny. I mean, it was like charismatic. He's a very charismatic leader. And he was like, I don't actually really like the United States. It's kind of dull, but I would have a whiskey with you and we could talk about this, even though I don't really drink whiskey that much. And but one thing he was like, but I don't really know if we could talk, because you think that I am not worth the same as you because I am Colombian, and he's like, and we are not going to step down to you. So I think in the end, even though his resistance, I think it did lead to negotiations. I think I do differ a little from José Luis on that the headlines. I do think they are definitely criticizing him, but I think it is true that Trump did somewhat win this, that he did get that they were able to send their military deportation planes here, even though Petro said that is not what would happen. But I do think it's amazing that this is the discourse that is being discussed, where he says Colombia no longer looks northward, it looks to the world, right? And then this is what we are having, especially showing that there is a difference in whereas the U.S. is trying that Trump's inaugural speech is about how the U.S. is no longer in decline, and this challenge that China is now the country that many look to, and that is what is happening in Latin America, where Colombia is saying, no, we don't look to the U.S. anymore. I think one thing that's amazing here in Mexico, culturally, of course, there's still a lot of connection to the United States culturally, and there will always be. But I think of all of my friends in the past few years, and all of them where they want, not all of them, a large percentage of friends where they dream to go is Korea and Japan. No one wants to visit the United States anymore. They don't care. They don't want to be in this whole long visa process where they think they won't be treated well, but they think it's boring. And I think it's interesting to see, when they talk about the soft influence of Korea culturally, it's really, you could see it in Mexico. And I think that relates to what Petro is saying here. Fine, if you don't want us, we don't care. But in the end, there's a reality that the U.S. was like, okay, then fine. We're not going to give visas to anyone in Colombia anymore. And people are like, oh, you're not gonna give us, like, of course there is a panic there that then, because you're prohibiting their freedom of movement, that people can no longer go to the United States. But anyways, yeah, so it's up there. I definitely recommend people check out his letter. If you speak Spanish, definitely read it in Spanish. It's much better, but there are people who have translated it.
In fact, let me just read a little bit of it, and then I'm going to let you respond, Jose Luis, because I know you have a little bit of a disagreement there. But there's a lot of great stuff. He mentions, I confess that I like Trump. He writes, Trump, I don't particularly enjoy traveling to the U.S. I find him a bit dull. Still, I must admit there are admirable aspects. And then he says, I confess that I like Walt Whitman, Paul Simon, Noam Chomsky, Arthur Miller. I also confess that Sacco and Vanzetti, who struggle and sacrifice to reflect my own roots, hold a special place in U.S. history. Is he Italian, I guess, Petro, or what? I don't know why it reflects.
I think it's a reference that he has Italian heritage.
Okay, that must be, yeah.
Right.
And deep cut with Sacco and Vanzetti. Maybe we'll get into that later with Greg Grandin. But yeah, Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti were Italian immigrant anarchists executed in 1927 after trial tainted by bias against their political beliefs and immigrant status. They became global symbols of labor rights and resistance to injustice. And then he writes, I don't like your oil policies, Trump. Your greed will destroy the human species. Perhaps one day over a glass of whiskey, which I'll accept despite my gastritis. We could talk frankly about this, but it's difficult because you see me as part of an inferior race, and I am not, nor is any Colombian. He also gives a shout out to Allende, the CIA-backed coup, overthrow of Allende, the support for Pinochet. So he mentions that he survived torture. He says, I survived torture and I will survive you. I do not want slavers near Colombia. We've had many and we freed ourselves. So what is your take on why this was not the failure that the media is portraying it as, Jose Luis?
Because I think the dispute was always about, treating them well, to not allow Trump to engage in this silly white supremacist theater, because that's what it is. And I think Petro is right to call him out on that and saying, you see me as lesser. I think that's a lot of what's driving these policies, and about, placating his xenophobic racist base that was expecting Trump to do this kinds of action to, there's an official messaging that deportations have begun coming from White House, offices and social media accounts. But I do think that, there is limits to this. And I think this whole episode shows that, yeah, he's willing to back up his bark with some bite, right? But also, he's not invincible. You can stand up to the bully. I think by trying to placate him constantly, you're going to find yourself in the position of like Justin Trudeau, who ultimately lost his position as prime minister as a result of his mishandling of this file. I think the response by the head of CELAC. So CELAC is a community of Latin American and Caribbean states. It's sort of the progressive alternative to the OAS, the Organization of American States. It includes all the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean, save for the US and Canada. And she, as the head of the CELAC group, called for an emergency meeting, which is meant to take place this Thursday. And I think that's exactly the response. There has to be a united response, because if we allow this to play out on a state to state basis, he's going to divide and conquer. And so Latin America needs to present a more united front. And I'm very glad that there was an enthusiasm for this meeting, to present that meeting. And also, Gustavo Petro announced that he will be taking over the leadership of CELAC, which is, I think, also a good sign to show that continuity to, there was a deliberate effort by the United States to try to destroy these institutions, because they do understand that they do provide that counter-hegemonic place for the region to unite against U.S. imperialism and U.S. intervention, which is also part of what this agenda is about, right? Why was he threatening to take over Panama again? It's such a weird contradiction, because it's a bit isolationist when it comes to economic policy, but also he seems to have a legitimate interest in territorial expansion. I do think that Mexico has to contend with a very real possibility that there could be unilateral military actions against this country by the Trump administration. He's talked a lot about doing things differently this time around. I think a lot of his early actions suggest that he's serious about that. He talked about how he regretted not bombing the cartels last time. If he does that, that'd be extraordinarily violent, especially given the fact that Mexico is not going to accept that kind of a relationship. One of the things that Claudia has been talking about constantly since the election of Trump, but even beforehand, has been, we can cooperate, but we're not going to submit to you. We're not a colony, right? We're not a protectorate. You have to respect our sovereignty. And I think that line also really works to shore up her support. I mentioned this earlier, but she enjoys 80% support across the polls, right? This isn't just biased selection. So far, all of this bluster from Trump has really served to unite. Even the opposition governor signed a letter saying that we reject these kinds of positions. So yes, Trump is a danger. Yes, he can fly off the handle, but he's not invincible, and he's playing with fire. We're already seeing that response. Before he took office, I said, be careful. The last time Latin America was united this way was when George W. Bush was in office, and he represented kind of that villainous U.S. president. He may provoke that situation again, and ultimately you'll see a position where, like kind of what Andalusia was saying, which is people looking elsewhere, right? Latin America always look to el otro lado, the other side. I went to Chinese New Year here in Mexico City, and there were so many people who turned out that you could barely walk. It shows that there is a really genuine interest now in looking elsewhere, and even to return to government policy, right? Massive investments in the Manzanillo Neoport to expand trade relationships with Asia, with the Pacific region. So, this could be ultimately, I'd love to hear what Greg, the historian, has to say after this, around this, that we look back and say that this was really the beginning of the end of U.S. hegemony in Latin America. I certainly hope so.
Oh, that'd be great. Well, since you both have mentioned Claudia Sheinbaum, I did want to show a video of her so people can have a sense of her, especially, because you Andalusia. And wait, it's Andalusia?
In Spanish is Andalusia.
Andalusia. Yeah, okay. Andalusia.
Right.
Yeah,
Andalusia, which is my nickname, which means
okay. That's why I was confused. Okay.
Right. And then Andalusia. Right. I have three names.
I'm gonna go with Andalusia. I like Andalusia.
Okay, that's all good.
Okay, cool. So you mentioned her demeanor. So let's take a look at a video where we can see this on display. This is Claudia Sheinbaum.
Pero que se oiga bien y que se oiga fuerte. Las y los mexicanos allá sostienen la economía de los Estados Unidos, en el campo, en los servicios, en todos lados. Estados Unidos no sería lo que es si no fuera por un pueblo trabajador que se vaya a ayudar. Así que van a recibir siempre nuestro apoyo, nuestra solidaridad, y si regresan a México, regresan con nuestros brazos abiertos para darles todo lo que se merecen, porque son generosos, solidarios, como es el pueblo mixteco y todos los pueblos de nuestro país.
Yeah, it's important to mention where that video was filmed. It was in Huitlahuaca, in La Mixteca de Oaxaca, which is a region that I have traveled to, where there is a really, really high number of people who have migrated to the United States, mostly to California, and to other parts, but first migrated working in the camps, the agricultural camps of California. But there's now been many generations, and there are actually even some somewhat ghost towns because so many people have migrated to the U.S. So she just went on this tour to all of these communities in rural Oaxaca, and so she was very strategic in where is that message coming from, because the majority of migrants that are coming back, they are not coming back to Mexico City. And that's also a big difference, is where they live in the United States. Many live in cities. And then when they are deported, then they're deported. And where can they go? Where they have family, where they were born. When Trump first took office, I actually traveled to a small town in Guanajuato with a colleague of mine, a Mexican journalist from Guerrero, Margen de la O, and we did a story on Guadalupe Garcia, who was the first deportee of Trump. So she was a woman who had been in the United States for 14 years, had American citizen children, they're still her children, and that she, I think, had an ICE appointment for many years. She would go to her appointment, and then when Trump first took power, she went to her appointment and she was detained. And activists in Arizona, in where Joe Arpaio had been sheriff, they had tried to block the vehicle from leaving and preventing her deportation. They were not successful. She was deported. And we went and visited her right as her children also were able to come and visit her at the same time, and it was like, this is a small town where I know nothing about life here. How am I going to survive? And then also there's this big thing is that if Trump says he's going to deport 1 million people, he's not just deporting those people. You are essentially deporting families, because if you are deporting largely the parents or the breadwinners of the family, who are the kids going to stay with? They're not just going to stay in the United States. They also will have to move to Mexico. And many times they don't speak the language. They don't have the right paperwork. And it's an enormous nightmare, really bureaucratic nightmare for people that are moving back to Mexico. And then, of course, there is also security issues, which we can't deny that in many places where people have migrated to the United States, they largely did leave for economic reasons. But of course, in more recent years, especially the last, I'd say 15 years, there are people that have migrated fleeing violence in Mexico. And then they don't know how they're going to return and fear for their lives to return to Mexico.
Well, this is actually a perfect transition for a meme that you posted, José Luis, that I want to show. Let's take a look at this meme. Okay, so for people who don't speak Spanish, I mean, it's pretty obvious, but intervention in, this is the Eric Andre shooting meme. So it says interventions in Latin America, and then it's why are there so many migrants? So can you talk about this?
Yeah, I mentioned this briefly, right? I mean, especially if you look at the most recent trends, where are they coming from? They're coming from places like Cuba. You have to remember, so Cuba really suffered as a result of the pandemic. A large of it, part of its economy was dependent on tourism, and it never really recovered. And they were really hoping that Biden, at the beginning of his term, was going to lift this designation that Trump imposed at the end of his first term of state-sponsored terrorism. And, it sounds like, oh, these are just the labels that the U.S. throws around, in the sense that they are. It's just a political term used to advance their interests. But it does have affects their ability to engage with banks, to engage with other parties. And so it was a really, really tough situation for Cuba. And then at the end of his term, Biden lifts it, but it ends up being totally meaningless, almost insulting, because of course Trump comes in and immediately imposes it. There is no basis to this. Cuba has actually played a huge role in preventing peace in Colombia, helping support the peace process. So this idea that they're state sponsors of terrorism is absurd, but it's a way of punishing them. And so we've actually seen a huge migration out of Cuba. I mean, it's hard to measure. There aren't exact figures, but they say that the island is down to about 9 million people from a much higher number, I believe, of closer to 14, 5 years ago. In the case of Venezuela, there has been a very similar type of blockade. The U.S. unilateral coercive measures are the reason why the Venezuelan economy is the way it is. The Venezuela's economy is built around oil. It has been since oil was discovered there. And it was actually always built in tandem with the U.S. That's why Citgo, the company that the U.S. is trying to steal, is actually a subsidiary of the state-owned oil company of Venezuela. And that has its headquarters in Texas, right? And so by limiting Venezuela's ability to sell oil in the international market makes it very, very difficult for them to have government revenues. And then, of course, the economy being built around this, all of the people who are kind of periphery to that economy are also negatively affected. There was also part of the regime change effort was actually an effort to convince people to leave Venezuela as part of the argument. Obviously, people are leaving for their own accords as well, because it is a very difficult situation, although there is an improvement that has been visible and measurable over the last few years. To say, oh, look at what a failed state, everybody's fleeing there, overcounting. I mean, we are talking about numbers in the millions, but it's not as high as some of the figures that you see, because, they'll count people as they come into Colombia and then into Peru, and then when they go into Ecuador. And so they're just like double or triple counting, but it was all part of that narrative to drive, Maduro has to go because look, he can't even take care of his own people kind of narrative. And so, I guarantee you that if they ended these unilateral coercive measures, which are illegal international law, these sanctions, that Venezuela's economy would nicely improve. And if you talk, there's so many Venezuelans here in Mexico, they all say the same thing. They may even be opponents of Maduro. They may say, oh, we can't stand the government anymore. But if you ask them, would you go back if the economy improved? They'd be like, oh, yeah, of course, immediately, right? They want to go home. As most migrants do. People are fleeing. They're being forced to leave. So this is just a handful of examples. I think those are being the most clear ones, which are also represent the biggest portion of them. But it's also interesting the way that even within his own coalition, apparently Maria Elvira Salazar, who is a representative, a Republican from Florida, is now worried about the lifting of this parole. So the parole is actually designed to facilitate people who can better integrate. So if they could find a sponsor or somebody who could support them economically, and now suddenly they're now in limbo, and they'll likely have to find a way to either get status or be deported back to Venezuela, which obviously, will struggle to absorb a return of that kind of quantity of people. So U.S. interventions in a lot of ways, and I'm so glad we can talk about this on the show because it never comes up. Everybody talks about migration on mainstream media, and nobody mentions what is
why they're
in that
right.
meme.
Right.
Exactly.
Like, why are they leaving?
Right. I would add to that a few years back on the when there was the large migrant caravan in 2018 that was in the U.S. press a lot and unfortunately manipulated, of course, by the U.S. press and Republicans to be like, look at these migrants, they're crazy, they're coming. But I was working in Tijuana documenting, or I followed the caravan for a lot of the way, and then in Tijuana when the migrants were had installed in an encampment, and they were waiting for to be able to get into the United States and request asylum. And there was these migrants that said, "We're here because you are there." Meaning we are here migrating because you, the United States, have invaded our countries, have extracted our resources, have dominated our economies,
Right.
and that is why. Right. So that is why. That we are here because you are there. And then also I wanted to make a reference that we were talking about earlier, and this goes to fleeing, which has to do with a few years back when there was the Syrian migrant, the Syrian Kurdish migrant, Aylan Kurdi, who was a 2-year-old boy who was found dead on a beach, and there was this poem that circulated that says, no one puts their children in a boat unless the water is safer than the land, And so this is why when they talk about migration and then say, okay, if it's so dangerous and people are being kidnapped in Mexico and women are being raped, why do people migrate? And it's because they are willing to risk their lives in this horrific journey because it's so dangerous from where they come from. And I think it's really important also to mention that as the United States cracks down on migration and wants to further militarize the border, the result is not that fewer people migrate. The people will still migrate. What happens is that they are then placed in even more dangerous, life-threatening conditions than they are currently in.
Right. It's not a deterrent. It just leads to more death and suffering. Right.
Correct.
And, most of the people who watch this show are very aware of how U.S. foreign policy has created this migration issue. But I am also curious if you guys can speak to kind of the argument of what should be done. I mean, a lot of people who are sympathetic to that argument will still say kind of like, well, let's fix that. Let's stop intervening, and then we won't have this problem, which kind of leads another problem, which is, okay, so should it only be people who are displaced by like the military interventions of the United States that get to come here? So what is the argument for why I guess Democrats, for instance, should be running on something other than being like Republican light, barely Republican light? What's the moral, but also like strategic, I guess, argument to push back on the anti-immigration sentiment? Big question, I know, but
I think strategic and moral are largely very different.
Right, that's what I'm asking.
Right.
See,
I think for strategic right now, although I do think it's important to mention that it's strategic, that all people have human rights and the human right to migrate. But I think that it's really ridiculous to see that what Trump campaigned on was against inflation. And of course, deporting all of the people that grow the food, that prepare your food, that deliver your food, are going to be deported and already receive extremely low wages because they are undocumented and can therefore be further exploited. Or even those that are documented with certain visa programs are often also exploited because I did a whole investigative comic about this 2 years ago about tobacco workers that were had received visas, the guest worker program visas, and then they lived in the worst conditions, but were scared that they had their passports confiscated, that the people who have applied for their visas and who run these farms won't let them leave. And so then they, if all these people are deported, and also more people do not migrate to the United States and work in these programs, who is going to prepare the food? Who is going to grow the food? And how on earth are prices going to lower? I saw, I think her name's Nikita, this woman who's hilarious on, like this whole trend on the social network. Like I put my makeup on while I
Right.
explain these complex issues to you. She was just walking, be like, how it's really annoying on a Saturday morning that you can't sleep because there's construction. Well, guess what? That construction project that maybe would have been done in a month is now going to take 10 months if they deport everyone that's working on the construction. You want to order and get your Uber Eats? Who's going to deliver it to you? And really like all of these comfortable ways of living that people in the United States are used to are so dependent on immigrant labor. So I don't think that is the right argument or the moral argument.
Right.
Immigrants are not just worth their cheap labor, right? But it is a strategic argument to say this is absurd to think that the United States, a country that was founded by immigrants, of course, stealing Native American land. And important to mention that Native Americans have been detained this week and questioned by ICE, thinking that they are migrants that should be deported. But anyways, going back to that is the founding of the United States. The United States is an immigrant nation. So how is it that they think that they could deport so many people and that the United States will continue to function and that the economy will continue to function, or that they put 25% tariffs on Mexico and then all the pickup trucks that all the Trump drive are going to increase in price and they're going to say, oh, thanks, Trump, for making the economy better. Maybe Jose could give the moral argument since I gave the strategic one, right?
I'm with you that they are separate things, and I'm an advocate for human rights and that the human mobility is a human right. I prefer to talk about it like that. It's perfectly normal. It's happened, and I have to also remember that for a lot of communities, especially in the Southwest, they didn't cross the border; the border crossed them. Right? They've been there for far longer generations than even some of the new settlers that are there. But one thing I wanted to bring up is the fact that a lot of people fail to realize that the U.S.'s #1 commercial partner now is not China, it's not Canada, it's not a country in Europe, it's Mexico. So much of your manufactured goods now come from here. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that, there's been this kind of, animosity towards China, and there's been a relocation of some of the manufacturing into Mexico, which has benefited Mexico, of course. There's now more jobs and better labor regime here. So, those jobs aren't as terrible as they used to be. Still a lot of room for improvement, but certainly headed in the right direction. If you impose this, your prices are going to go up. It's going to drive up inflation. But the other thing to consider is that if you do negatively impact the Mexican economy, which is very much integrated with the North American, US and Canada now as a result of the 94 trade agreement and the more recent USMCA, that you're actually going to have a negative effect here. And that's going to drive more migration, not from countries in Central America or South America, but from Mexico. And so if you're interested in actually, let's take it as a given. I think it's disputable. I think, I don't think attitudes are as xenophobic as the polls suggest that they are. But even if that is the case,
it depends on how the questions are asked also, right?
Yeah, of course, right? And then I think there's just been a lot of, manipulation of that data. But even if you take that as a given, right? If you don't want more migration, then you need to abandon this terrible idea of imposing tariffs and actually making and punishing the Mexican economy as a result of that. That tariff policy is not intended to do that. I mean, Trump is relying on the fact that people don't understand that tariffs are paid by the consumer. But the other thing is around, that it'll provoke this mass migration, likely, or an interest in mass migration from Mexico. And so it's just a dead end no matter how you look at it. But the episode with Colombia showed us that threatening retaliatory tariffs also gets the U.S. paying attention. I was reading articles there. Apparently, this Petro, who said, okay, we'll impose tariffs in kind, is one of the reasons why Trump also backed down. And in the case of Mexico, Claudia was explicit in her very first communication, this letter that she wrote to Trump. She said, if you engage in tariffs against us, we're going to start a tariff war because we're going to retaliate. And then you'll see that we're ultimately just going to destroy our economies and nobody comes out on top as a result of that. So my argument would be, you don't want to go down this road. And again, to go back to this, if you do, you're just going to push us further into the arms of what you perceive to be their enemies, which is, other countries, the BRICS, China, Pacific region. Watch out.
Yeah. Well, thank you guys so much. I have so many more questions, but we've run out of time. So I'm going to have you guys back on again to talk about things, including the drug war. Well, one last question. We don't have time to show this, but I'll put it in later. Andalusia, I know you made a documentary that deals with called Poppy Crash. That looks at fentanyl. Can you just give a quick summary of what that documentary shows?
Sure. So my film Poppy Crash, which is circulating in film festivals right now in Mexico and other parts of the world in the United States, is flipping the script on the fentanyl crisis. So we see, of course, in the United States press, as it should be, something that is in the media, the tens of thousands of people who have been affected by opiates, who are addicted, who die as a result of these drugs. And then the US has often blamed Mexico, of course, for this entire problem, which is not the case, that Mexico is the sole responsibility that people in the United States consume fentanyl. But basically 20 years ago, when the opioid crisis was just starting in the United States and where people were starting to consume heroin, Mexico became one of the main producers of opium for heroin production. Farmers, largely indigenous farmers in rural areas, largely Guerrero and then in Sinaloa, produced poppy. They stopped growing corn, they stopped growing beans, they stopped growing their traditional crops to grow poppy flowers, and then that was exported, of course, as opium and as heroin. And then all of a sudden, within the past few years, the price, it plummeted. Then they were like, wait, we can no longer grow this. This is what, we don't even know what this is. We don't consume it, but we have dedicated the last 20 years of our lives to growing it because that's what you said you wanted, and you'll pay us 100 times more than you'll pay us for the corn that we normally grow. And so therefore they now are left without their cash crop. And it's not that the cash crop is, and they really got rich off of it, but they really were able to no longer migrate to the United States. These are communities that largely migrated because they were able to stay in their communities and grow poppy and survive off of it. And now they are largely migrating to other parts in Mexico, to northern Mexico, to work and be exploited in agricultural camps, and then also, of course, to the United States. And so it's called Poppy Crash because it's about what is this impact, how the fentanyl crashed the poppy market, and then kind of flipping the script and seeing how this affects the people that actually grow the poppy.
Right. Yeah. And of course, somehow Lindsey Graham is always blaming Mexico and China for the drug problems of the United States. So that's an interesting take. Well, thank you guys so much. And please do come back on.
Yeah. Can I do a quick pitch before I go?
Of course. Yeah.
So for your English speaking followers, listeners, we have a podcast, Soberanía. It's in English. It's weekly, so we try to analyze from a leftist perspective and anti-imperialist perspective Mexican developments. But also, I wanted to pitch for your Spanish-speaking viewers. We just started a brand new TV show with Canal 11 here. It's a public television station called Sin Muros, and it's exactly aimed at exploring the bilateral relationship. We think that this is one of the things that's been not talked about enough, certainly not enough in U.S. outlets. And so it's available on YouTube, and it's a labor of love here. And, you know, people really are putting a lot of effort into getting this out there because it's important to have that conversation from a Mexican perspective. You know, I'm there, Kurt Hackbarth, who's, you know, he's from the U.S., but he's lived in Mexico for more than 20 years. And Alina Duarte as well, who's probably familiar to some of your viewers as well, is on that show. So it'd be great if we could get people to tune into that as well and give some support. So, and thank you so much for having me.
Of course. Yeah. And I was going to show you, you guys had a really fascinating conversation about why Mexico in a non-xenophobic way should refuse to accept non-Mexican nationals, which we'll talk about on another episode.
All right.
Okay.
Thanks for having us on.
Great. Bye. All righty, guys, don't go anywhere because that was a great segment. And we have another segment, and I'm so excited to be bringing back to the Katie Halper Show, although I think he hasn't been on the show since we became a live stream show. I think he was just on when we were a podcast, although we did do a live taping once together in Brooklyn. Greg Grandin, who's a professor of history at Yale University. He's the author of a number of prize-winning books, including most recently The End of the Myth, From the Frontier to the Border Wall in the Mind of America, and The Empire of Necessity, Slavery, Freedom, and Deception in the New World, which won the Bancroft and Beveridge Prizes in American History and was shortlisted for the Samuel Johnson Prize in the UK. He's also the author of Fordlandia, The Rise and Fall of Henry Ford's Forgotten Jungle City, a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in History, as well as for the National Book Award. So we are going to bring on Greg Grandin. Hi, Greg.
Hey, Katie. Hi, how are you?
Good, you?
Pretty good.
Well, as good. Sorry, what were you going to
As
say?
good as we expected.
Yeah, I know.
There's so much stuff going on. It's
Yeah,
hard to keep
yes. It's
little whiplash.
dismal world right now.
Yeah.
But I actually want to just jump into the conversation and show a clip of Donald Trump from his inauguration, because it almost was like written for Greg Grandin to analyze. So let's just take a look at this short clip of Donald Trump.
Above all, China is operating the Panama Canal, and we didn't give it to China. We gave it to Panama, and we're taking it back. The United States will once again consider itself a growing nation, one that increases our wealth, expands our territory, builds our cities, raises our expectations, and carries our flag into new and beautiful horizons. And we will pursue our manifest destiny into the stars.
Manifest destiny into the stars.
I mean, he's
So
such a bad, when he has to read a speech, he's so underwhelming. His talent is obviously the extemporaneous kind of nonsense that he babbles. But I mean, I think, he talked about the frontier spirit is stamped on us. And, obviously somebody whoever wrote that speech read Frederick Jackson Turner and, gave a kind of potted history of the frontier theory of U.S. history that the United and which is to a large degree true, that the United States has been a nation that has expanded since its founding. That is what makes it exceptional and unique, is just this idea of constant growth, across the continental frontier, manifest destiny. But then even after the continent, the frontier was closed, then through markets, through wars to rid the world of evil. So the idea of expansion out into the world is what makes the United States thrive. It's where we can vent, extremism, where you can reconcile different constituencies with contradictory interests. And Trump was kind of, it seems to me, I mean, what's most striking about it is compared to his first inaugural address, which was very, that American carnage, address, which was very inner-directed, and I think that, part of him instinctively knows that kind of inner-directed anger and aggrieved nationalism is inherently chaotic and destructive, and as it was in his first term. And so he was reaching for maybe something a little bit more rousing and invigorating, and short of promising people health care and decent social rights, the only thing that the United States has really is the promise of expansion. And there's Trump, talking about going to the stars. I mean, of course, it's all simulacra. We live in this weird world. In the 19th century, when competing robber barons were basically scamming the federal government for money to build railroads to the Pacific, at least we got the railroads out of it. At least it had material effects. It created the West. It brought enormous misery to Native Americans, but it did have material effects. Now we have Bezos and Trump, looting the federal treasury to get to Mars, and for what? It's like the dream world of billionaires we live in. So Trump. So it is interesting. But what else is interesting is all of this very aggressive. I mean, he actually said, once the frontier closed, other presidents continued the metaphor of the frontier through science and markets and whatever. He actually said in that speech, we're going to grow our territory.
Right.
I mean, last I looked, the map is all filled out. There's not a lot of territory left to grow into, and which is quite an aggressive statement. And when he's talking about, taking Greenland by force and the Panama Canal by force, and I think there's probably material reasons why the U.S. wants Greenland, and this is a little bit of a tangent.
No,
That
I'm
Trump has this kind of witchy way of making what was actually by bipartisan consensual ideas, making them sound totally outlandish. The United States has long wanted Greenland, from William Seward in the 19th century through FDR and Truman to Rockefeller. The U.S. had plans to buy Greenland. Trump comes along and it sounds like a crazy idea, and so I'm sure there are security and economic reasons why Trump wants Greenland, but there's also this way in which he's signaling, I think, a more dangerous kind of, the old liberal world order after World War II. It had its, hypocrisies, it had its brutalities, and its lapses and its ideals. But at least it was based on the premise that aggressive war was outlawed, that all nations shared mutual interests, that diplomacy should be, first step in international relations, that war and force should be a last resort. Obviously, that wasn't always the case, but at least those were the foundational principles. I think Trump is signaling that those are no longer the foundational principles. The foundational principles now is nations are inherently competitive, that aggression is legitimated, that conquest is once again valid, and that dominance is the end point of international relations. I think you see it. After that's just yesterday, it was reported that he had a phone call with the Prime Minister of Denmark, and it was apparently a shit show. It was an angry phone call. Denmark got off the phone saying, "What the fuck was that?" And today it was just reported that France is considering sending troops to Greenland to back up Denmark. I mean, it all, on the one hand, it's hilarious. On the other hand, it's like, it's amazing. This is NATO. This is Europe. This has been the foundation of the United States' foreign policy to, over the centuries, to allow to basically superintend a world order in which the United States was the hegemon, Europe was the second tier, and then everything else came under it. And now here's Trump picking fights with France and Denmark over Greenland. It's really a remarkable moment that could spin out of control.
Yeah, well, let's take a look at a tweet by friend of the show, I'm sure, David Frum, and here's what he had to say, because you retweeted a great response to this. Do we have that tweet ready, Brad? Okay. Since 1941, the U.S. has defended democracies against aggression by predators. Trump has reversed that proud tradition to become a predator himself, who threatens democratic Denmark with U.S. aggression. And I think you retweeted someone who said, I speak for, Alonso Gurmendi tweets, "I think I speak for my fellow Latin Americans when I say lol, LMAO even." So what is your response to this analysis of, I mean, I guess
of course it's ridiculous. Well, it's what I was saying. It's like, the United States has engaged in all sorts of acts of aggression, particularly in Latin America, as your previous guests have pointed out, coups and wars of aggression against Nicaragua and invasions in Panama to basically, carry out a warrant, to capture Manuel Noriega. We've, overthrown governments. We try, Trump himself has tried to overthrow Maduro in Venezuela with, there's, no shortage of acts of aggression that the United States has been engaged in, from Vietnam and Southeast Asia to Indonesia. I mean, to what was called East Pakistan and is now called Bangladesh. I mean, you can go on and on and on. But I mean, I do think it is. I think ideology matters, and I do think that rhetoric matters, and I do think foundational principles matter. And despite all of that, the world order that came out of World War II had basically invalidated the doctrine of conquest, outlawed wars of aggression, and defined cooperation as the first principle of international relations. Now, no matter how many times those principles were violated, it was still a foundation to work off of. And I think Trump's speech act. Trump is a giant speech act, to quote linguistical scholars, in which the saying of a thing makes it so, and
right.
Trump is, he's signaling that the doctrine of conquest, which we were told had passed its expiration date, is still valid. It's still in play.
But it's just rich coming from David Frum, who was one of the architects of the Iraq War, right?
But even that, they had to have the cosmetic
pretense, right?
The pretense of a coalition, even if it wasn't the UN, it was still a coalition,
right?
And and so yes, you could argue both sides of this. What does it matter if they still able to do it? What does it matter about the pretense? I think Trump's reaction to Petro yesterday was precedent setting. Again, the United States has done horrible things in Latin America. They're responsible for hundreds of thousands of deaths and genocide in Guatemala and running death squads for decades. But the U.S. did treat Latin American nations, short of out and out enemies, with diplomacy. To come right out of the gate with not just the threat of tariffs, but slapping sanctions on Petro himself, and the United States have this enormous power in financial power to control financial transactions. This all came out of the 2008 reconstruction of the financial system, all the SWIFT codes and all of that stuff. To be so aggressive so immediately is really a kind of new level of relations with the world. I do think I'm not one of these people who, the whole fascism debate and his Trump, but I do think that there is
and you're a huge critic of the Democrats also. People should know.
Yeah,
people
of course,
understand where you're coming from.
Yeah, of course. All of this expedited, deportation comes from Clinton's anti-immigration law, which he signed, I think, in 1996. It comes from Clinton, and it comes from Obama, and it comes from Biden. But it's really seems a very precarious moment.
How does this reconcile with his, paying lip service to being anti-war?
Well, he's not anti-war.
He's
not anti-war. He's anti. He's in his mind. He's there is the current within the right that's against the war of the globalists or the liberal internationalists. There's a current within the right that has always been hostile to the kind of internationalism. It didn't make them isolationists, but they were hostile to the internationalism. They were hostile to the internationalism of FDR, of Truman, of Dulles, of Marshall, of Atchison, because in their mind they imagined that it was to engage with the world on that level was to give up a degree of sovereignty and allow things like social rights and demands for segregation and civil rights in through the back door, through treaties. So when the United States signed, the right hated the surrender treaty with Japan that John Foster Dulles organized, because it talked about, it had some anti-racist a clause in it. So there was always this fear that like a certain kind of internationalism would force a restructuring of social relations within the United States. So there's been a faction of the right that has always hated that kind of internationalism, but they were by no means ever isolationists. In fact, they tended to they tended to embrace the Monroe Doctrine. They tended to see Latin America as a place where the United States could exercise mandatory police power and had a right to, and Trump in his first term was bombing all over the place, right? I mean, he was dropping bombs, he was killing, and he was launching preemptive assassinations against Iranian. Yeah, so he's by no means is he anti-war. He
pays lip service to it, right?
He did inherit a mess that the Bush wing of the Republican Party left him, and so it's easy to criticize that, and because they hate him equally. So then it becomes a kind of debating point. But I wouldn't say that he's anti-war.
Yeah, it's interesting though. Last week we had on 2 anti-war military vets, and I can't remember what they said, but they had a good analysis, and I'm going to make a clip about it, of the different types of pro-war. Basically, I think it's just like the targets are slightly different when it comes to the neoliberals and as John Mearsheimer says, neoliberals and neocons are pretty similar, but there's a difference between the types of war that Trump engages in and the types of war that Biden engages in. And so Trump can point to the ones that he won't do and claim to be anti-war, but of course he can also point to, or we can also point to, what he's threatening with Greenland. And another thing I wanted to ask you about was the history and the significance of the Panama Canal, because I don't think a lot of people even know the history of that canal and its construction. Can you talk about that?
Well, Panama was part of Colombia. It was a province of Colombia up until 1903. I mean, it was in 1901, 1903, and the United States wanted a canal. Other sites for a potential canal was that thin part of Mexico, or maybe through Nicaragua, connecting through Lake Nicaragua. There was an effort to build a canal through Nicaragua. Then Panama was settled on, and basically Theodore Roosevelt and during the Roosevelt, basically ginned up an independence movement in Panama. That then Roosevelt sent battleships stationed off the coast and recognized the independence of Panama. So Colombia was angry about this for quite a long time, and the work on the canal got started, I think, in 1905, and it was still going on by 1911, 1912, 1913. It was about to be wrapped up, and Woodrow Wilson was president, and Wilson, this was the early Wilson before he turned darker, and he actually paid reparations to Colombia for the U.S.'s actions with Panama, and threw Roosevelt into a hissy fit, a nationalist hissy fit. I mean, Roosevelt started touring the country, giving talks about, so this is like, Panama is a very a fetish object for the U.S. right for quite a long time. Roosevelt would say, well, if Wilson really believes that we took the canal, that we took Panama illegally, then he should stop work and U.S. engineers should leave Panama bag and baggage and just let the Colombians finish the canal. And of course, that's not what happened. Jimmy Carter negotiated, the return of the canal, which eventually was returned during the Clinton and last years of the Clinton administration, and Ronald Reagan ran on keeping the canal. It's long been a kind of, an object of, within the right, the nationalist right its kind of obsession with. Panama has run the canal for over 2 decades, and it's run it quite efficiently. It upgraded it and maintains it. It traffic flows. There's been no problems. It's not a sea level canal. It's there's a series of locks because one part is higher than the other, and so there is talk about building a wider modern canal that didn't have to which ships could move through quicker and faster without having to wait for the movement of the locks and the films of the locks. But as to whether Panama is charging us more money than they should is charge. I mean, I don't know what the rates are about shipping rates. I don't know. That sounds like such a New York real estate.
Right.
I mean, this is somebody who doesn't pay his own bills.
Right.
And
it's funny though that
he
didn't run on this.
And here's the thing: the president of Panama is a conservative, and this is like typical Trump. Trump, Latin America is really kind of, teetering between the right and the left at the moment. There's Lula's in Brazil, but he's sick, and Bolsonaro's in waiting. Boric and Gabriel and Boric in Chile isn't popular. Petro is very vocal, but he's his poll numbers are pretty low. There's Honduras, there's Uruguay, there's a few center left governments. But you have Bukele in El Salvador, who's really much closer to a fascist regime than Trump in terms of mass incarceration, but people are fed up with crime. The crime is on the rise. And people find that solution very attractive. So there's a potential base for Trumpism within Latin America to make MAGA a continental hemispheric movement. So on the one hand, there's that, but then on the other hand, as your previous guest was speaking, Trump's actions also provoke a backlash because the idea of sovereignty, national sovereignty, is very cherished in Latin America. And it's and it's hard. So I mean, even with Canada, Doug Ford comes from the Ford family, right? MAGA before there was MAGA, is running around wearing a hat. Canada's not for sale. Maybe we'll buy Minnesota. So it seems like Trump, even though the potential is there to actually become an international movement, a hemispheric movement, which would be horrible, right? It would be a disaster. Trump almost can't help himself by provoking the people that could be natural allies.
And can you talk about the significance of McKinley, President McKinley, and the way that Trump has kind of embraced him? There's obviously Mount McKinley, which was called Denali. He I think fashions himself like a modern day McKinley, but as you pointed out in this interview that you just did with the New Yorker, there are significant differences.
Yeah, well, yes. Well, one of them was massive immigration into the United States and an open border on Mexico at the time with no checks whatsoever. It was in the 1890s. McKinley was McKinley's known for two things, most importantly. One is the War of 1898. So with the U.S. frontier closed, McKinley makes that leap into the next stage of the United States' weird brand of informal empire. Takes Panama, takes Puerto Rico, Cuba, the Philippines, Guam. It turns Cuba into an independent republic, although more of a trusteeship. The Philippines, it keeps till the 1940s. Still has Puerto Rico. So McKinley's noted for that kind of rush into the, that leap into empire or overseas empire. And he's also noted for high tariff walls, like in the McKinley tariffs, are famous. He raised very high tariffs and the kind of real drive. I mean, the Industrial Revolution obviously had been going on for decades prior to McKinley, but the 1890s really were like this moment where the U.S. industry took off on a major scale as a result of those tariffs. I don't know to the degree Trump has studied any of this. I mean, the other fact about McKinley is he was assassinated in office.
Right. Yeah, probably doesn't identify with that part. No. But he had, very different kind of ideological dressings for his imperial or his expansionist policies, right? I mean, unlike Trump, he actually tried to dress them up.
Yeah. Well, he and others, there was a big push, there was a big demand to move. I mean, this wasn't all just McKinley. This was a moment. A lot of new left diplomatic historians studied the crisis of 1893, which was one of the worst economic, collapses up until that point in industrial capitalism, and how there emerged from that crisis a sense that the United States needed markets and needed to expand. That whether you were a labor reformer, whether you were a minister, whether you're a capitalist, whether you were a politician, they were all came together a general consensus that the United States, having reached the end of the frontier, had to move out, and Cuba offered a perfect opportunity to justify it because Spain was waging a very vicious counterinsurgent war to keep Cuba, and there emerged among what we might call the progressive class a wellspring of support for going in and saving Cuba from Spain. And it was one of the first time human rights was explicitly used as a justification. But the other thing was the Philippines. This was also to get staging ground into the China market, because Europe, Germany, Great Britain, and France were all making inroads into the China market, and getting the Philippines positioning the United States to be competitive with those nations into the China market. So it was like a kind of double move. It solidified the United States in the Caribbean, or the Lake of America. With the Gulf of America. Right. As it's now called, and set the United States up to move into China.
Yeah. Well, going back to the question of Trump and immigration, I want to show this clip that's been making the rounds of Dr. Phil talking to Trump's immigration czar, Tommy Homan. Let's take a look at what he had to say, both Dr. Phil and the czar, about what they're doing to crack down on this problem.
So forget the false narrative of sweeping neighborhoods looking for people of different color than us. Forget that hogwash and look at what we actually did. We're proving it to them. How can you argue with the system we've set up?
Well, straight up, are you going into schools and arresting children at schools?
No.
Is anything like that happening?
No, sir.
Are you going into businesses and sweeping through there and taking anybody with a tan and seeing where they're from?
We go into businesses for a criminal enforcement operation, but again, sweeps don't occur anywhere.
The sweeps are not occurring. You're just not going in like seining for fish in a pond and just picking up. You're going targeted. If a criminal is working in a business and you have to pick them up there, you're going in for that target.
Absolutely.
And what's happening to me, it seems that these politicians are creating what they fear the most. and that is forcing ICE agents into the community where they pick up the target and wind up picking up collaterals that may be around them, as opposed to going to the jail where they just get the target and leave.
That's the game they want to play, and so, game on. We're going to do it. I mean, it's all about public safety. We're going to take that public safety threat off the street by any means necessary. If we can't get in the jail, then we'll go in the neighborhood.
Yeah, and Chris, look, we've got two very high-risk apprehensions that are going down within minutes. I can tell you that these are bad actors that are doing things that are immediate, instant danger to anyone around them. I'm not going to say what they are right now, because even describing it could be tipping off who we're talking about. And if they happen to be watching this, or somebody they know is watching this, could pick up the phone and call them and put agents' lives in more danger than they already are.
That's right.
That's why we're being very careful. That's why we're asking all of you in the control room to process these videos and blur the faces of the brave men and women that are doing what they're doing, because we don't want them harassed and targeted after the fact. And that has and does happen. So we're being very careful to protect everybody out there. But just know, listen, whether you're seeing this on Merit TV or Merit or all of our different social platforms, this narrative that they're out sweeping and picking up people indiscriminately is absolutely untrue. Absolutely untrue. These are a lot of investigation happening. They're targeting individuals that have criminal histories and are a danger to the community, and they're making communities safer when they take them off the street.
Okay, so want to know your response to that. Also, I did notice that you responded to that tweet. You wrote, time to dust off.
Someone's paying attention.
Yeah, time to dust off copy of Robert J. Lifton's Nazi Doctors, Medical Killing and the Psychology of Genocide. So what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I mean, he's like Baghdad Bob, he sounds like. I mean, it's like such propaganda, and it's so ham-handed. I mean, how many times can you repeat that these aren't just sweeps? These aren't just sweeps. Like, so what are they doing then? I mean, they really have. I honestly, I haven't followed it too closely because it's happened, but is ICE saying that it has a list of names of people that they're specifically looking for? Then, I find that hard to believe. But that clip, but just getting back to that clip, just the whole thing is just so gross, and it's just such a gross display of propaganda, and it's so ham-handed, and it's like, a reality TV star or whatever he is. I mean, is he a real doctor?
I actually don't know if he's a real doctor. Is he a real doctor? Someone should tell us and put in the notes.
My understanding is he was at one point a practicing psychologist in Texas, but that was a long time ago.
Yeah. Well, but not an MD.
No.
Yeah.
No.
Okay.
Never.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, just to get back to that tweet, it was a little bit of an elevation. It was too much of it. It was a little bit of an elevation of who Dr. Phil was.
Right.
Not, I don't know what, but it was just the it's just all a spectacle. It's all spectacle. It's like the military planes, the cargo planes, the shackles on the hands and the feet. Again, Biden, Obama, they deported more people. Obama definitely deported more people than Trump did in his first term. Biden, I think there were some years that were up and down. But it's the turning it into a spectacle, which is which is the qualitatively different thing. And I say use the word qualitative because it is. I think it is it is different. It's a different level of imperial subjectivity. There's a level of cruelty there that I think is specific to a kind of unraveling of the nation's psyche of an imperial power. This was in some ways the argument of end of the myth. It's what happens when expansion and the promise of limitlessness is no longer no longer an option when politicians can't use the promise of limitlessness to organize domestic politics. The extremism turns inward, but also the cruelty, I think, is a kind of cruelty that is uniquely of the United States. I think it has to do with United States alone among other liberal nations never socialized its liberalism. It held on like a fetish to the idea of freedom is freedom from restraint. And that's an idea that you can only maintain as long as the frontier is open. And once it's not, then freedom is freedom from restraint becomes manifest as no one's gonna stop me from being cruel. No one is gonna stop me. No one is gonna make me care. Nobody's gonna make me be empathetic. There's a degree of inhumanity at play here that I find terrifying. I mean, I think there's a psychologist who talks about the slow creation of humanity, how long it took over centuries to come up with the idea of equality, and that all people were equal. Obviously, that not everybody believed that, but in some ways there's a kind of the slow or the fast destruction of humanity is I think at play here, and that's what I find very disturbing about Trump.
So, yeah, I mean, I do think that there is this qualitative difference, obviously. I think that sometimes, like, liberals underestimate the similarities when it comes to policies between the Democrats and the Republicans. And then I think some people who I share politics with in general dismiss the significance of these qualitative differences.
Yeah.
Because I think rhetoric and discourse do matter.
They do matter. And the resistance liberals tend to refuse to acknowledge issues of political economy and how the Democrats, are responsible for the post 8 years of Clinton and whether it be NAFTA, whether it be WTO, whether it be GATT, whether it be the deregulation of telecommunications, deregulation of finance, all of the things, the deregulation of telecommunication. There's a direct relation between domestic polarization and Clinton's deregulation of the telecommunications industry. So there's cause and effect, and there's the resistance liberals want to fight Trump by hearkening back to some kind of pure republic that never existed, whether it be the founders or whether it be the time immediately before Trump. They don't see, they don't understand history as process, and how the Democrats went from being a party that was never a purely working class party, but certainly had strong working class bent, and how it transitioned into a party of the suburbs and elites, and how that contributed to the cultural wars itself.
Right. Can you talk more about that? Can you just expand on that, what you just brought up?
Well, under the New Deal had, the Democrats had put into place universal policies like Social Security and then later on Medicare and Medicaid. They understood. They always, to some degree, they always were straddling this kind of corporatist working class divide to some degree. But the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union really kicked away the restraints. And Clinton restructured the Democratic Party along corporate lines. And, part of that, I guess, was the crisis of the 1970s, the failure of the Carter presidency, the economic crisis of Keynesianism, fumbling around for a solution. But despite the multiple crises and fallout from Vietnam and Watergate and the contradictions of Keynesianism in the 1970s, and Clinton inherited a country that didn't have an enemy anywhere in the world. And, the Soviet Union was wiped off the face of the earth, and the political class, mostly under the Democrats, began to treat the citizens like a belligerent population, that had to be contained. I mean, the number of the crime laws and the terrorism laws that were passed under Clinton, every country every country coming out of the 1970s restructured its economy. Every wealthy country in Europe, in the West, restructured its economy to some degree to deal with a rising third world, higher energy prices, new forms of competition. The United States is the only country that so gleeful not only restructured the economy, but did away with any of the institutions that could mediate the worst effects of that restructuring. The attack, the assault on unions, the gutting of the welfare state, the destruction of small rural communities. All of these things were devastating, and they led to I think a crisis that in many ways we're still living with, and ultimately gives rise to Trump. I mean, there's a lot between that and Trump, but I do think that the globalization as a principle to organize the world, economic globalization, the principle to organize the world after the end of the Cold War, in retrospect, was catastrophic for the United States.
And I just want to bring up another tweet of yours, actually, that relates to this, kind of. So Joan Walsh, who was at The Nation, tweeted the following. So she was responding to someone, Noga Tarnopolsky, who tweeted out, "As sure as a Swiss clock, Netanyahu emerges after Trump speaks with or without full awareness of emptying Gaza of Gazans to thank Donald Trump, ostensibly for the big bombs." And then Joan Walsh writes, "People who didn't vote for Harris over Gaza sure made life a lot better for Gazans, huh? It was a binary choice, people. We were telling you what Trump would do. I hope we see some sincere mea culpas." And then your response was very respectful. "Who knows what Trump will do, and history provides no counterfactual tests. But have you seen those pictures of Gazans returning? If this happened under Biden, Harris wins. Uncommitted, begged for mere gestures, and she sent Richie Torres to Michigan."
Yeah,
which is true.
Well, what was amazing about that Joan Walsh quote was that it was during the high point of this incredible joyous moment. But
Right.
How could how oblivious could you possibly be? I mean, who knows?
Joyous, but also painful, obviously, because there's the wreckage, and it looks like a.
I know, but people were coming in and raising flags. And, it was and how can
a return, a march of return? It was a march of return.
Yeah, how can you not say that was better than what was in the bomb?
Right, of course, yeah.
It's amazing. It was amazing. Well, Gaza really is a kind of I think one of those things that you don't escape from easily in terms of what it's done to the world's morality, I think. And so
yeah, I was going to actually, as like a final question for you, I want to know, as a historian of empire, what your thoughts on Gaza are and what it reveals about imperialism, about the relationship between Israel and the United States.
Well, I mean, I think most of your viewers and listeners will know the obvious, but I do think it is a turning point. I mean, I think that it's staggering, the destruction, and watching genocide in real time, and the callousness in which people justified the murder of children, the murder of healthcare workers and reporters and teachers, and it was just it just was wrenching, and I don't think you get over that easily. I think it is part of the larger collapse of that post-world order, the almost symmetrical kind of hypocrisy between Ukraine, condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine and funding a proxy war to defend Ukraine against Russia, whatever one's thoughts about the wisdom of that and how it relates to larger geopolitics, but to watch that happen as Gaza plays out is staggering. And then to watch, then it turns out that all it needed was a stern phone call from Trump's real estate, that guy that he sent there,
Witkoff, right?
Yeah. Who is that guy? That guy was some.
Yeah, someone who refused to not negotiate on Sabbath, which I thought was funny. He's Jewish, but he wanted to get this out of the way.
Yeah, he's one of these Trump guys that are from New York, right? Or something, or something. Yeah, and just the all of a sudden the war's not over, but those scenes of the bombing and sniper firing at children are over, at least for now, and it's I don't know. On the one hand, I don't see how Israel itself recovers from this as a legitimate nation. I think its isolation is going to be pretty total. I don't see how it ends, and I guess I don't have any insights into what Trump's larger plans are. If he really wants to push everybody into the deserts of Saudi Arabia or whatever, and then turn Gaza into a resort, I don't know. We'll give it to Israel. What's going to happen on the West Bank? I don't know anything that's going to happen there, but I don't see how Israel, recovers as the foundations of its justification have been shattered, and I don't see. I think it's just been catastrophic. I mean, the damage it's done. I mean, you saw it in the political campaign. I mean, I think Gaza was the reason why Harris couldn't run to the center left and had to run to the center right. For whatever reason, I don't know, whether it was ideological, whether there was, party pressure, whether it was AIPAC, whatever it was, but she latched herself to Biden's, Israel policy and wouldn't put any distance between it. And I think once she did that, she had no choice but to run a center right campaign that was dead in the water as soon as she embraced Liz Cheney and short of sending Fetterman to Dearborn with dead Palestinian children in chains and dead Palestinian children in chains. I don't know what she could have done even worse than
sending Richie Torres and Bill Clinton. I'm speaking. That was another hit. Yeah. Well, Greg, thank you so much. Any final words from you? You've been so generous with your time.
Oh, no. It's always great to talk with you, Katie. It's always fun.
Yeah.
I love your show. Where are you? Where are you?
I'm at my parents' place upstate right now. I'm usually in the city. Yeah. It's I'll tell you afterwards because you don't know if they're crazy people watching.
It's undisclosed.
But, the last thing, tell us about your book that's coming out in April, right?
Oh yeah, April 22nd. America, a new history of the new world, and it starts with the conquest and it effectively ends with Gaza at this point. Just the making an argument that it's history of the Western Hemisphere, but it makes an argument for the importance of the Western Hemisphere, particularly ideological struggle between the British and the Spanish, and then between the U.S. and Latin America in shaping the international order, and in defeating fascism, and then shaping the international order.
Interesting.
And that the way you defeat and that Latin America as a model for fighting fascism is to offer an alternative that includes social rights and social democracy.
Right. Yeah, good lesson for the Democrats here too, right?
Yeah.
Well, I hope they read it.
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't hold my breath, but
well, I'll have to have you back on once that's out.
Yeah, that would be great.
Okay. Thanks so much, Greg.
Bye.
Have a great night. Bye. Okay, that was great. Thank you so much. That was a great show. Also, I do want to announce some sad news. So Brad and I were actually referring to, I think a couple of weeks ago, we said something about how like you should make sure to value your time. We kind of hinted that someone we knew was sick. Brad, do we have a clip ready?
Okay.
So I'll just tell people. So Rene Lichtman, who was one of like our favorite characters, who was a Holocaust survivor. He was a hidden child in Paris. And we luckily had the good luck and good fortune of visiting him in October. And he was this amazing figure because he started protesting at this Holocaust museum where he himself used to lecture. So he would speak at this Holocaust museum because he was very committed to Holocaust education. But for him, Holocaust education meant never again for anyone. And what happened was when the museum that he used to speak at in Detroit or outside Detroit, near Detroit, refused to mention Gaza, and they had in the past mentioned other genocides. I mean, they spoke about Rwanda, so it's not like they didn't understand how to make those connections. But when they refused to talk about Gaza, he started doing a vigil across the street from the museum. And then he was not surprisingly removed as a speaker. And one of the last conversations that we had was him telling me that he had been basically sidelined by this organization that he usually went to their meetings, and he didn't get notified because of his speaking out against Gaza. But he also was very excited that I had gotten a dog, and he said I was going to be very spoiled. So that was a nice conversation. And yeah, I'll just show you a clip, but he just passed away today. And he was 86 or 87, and he was fascinating. He was an artist. He got Greg was a Pulitzer nominee. Fulbright scholar. He was a Fulbright scholar. Went to music and art, my mom's alma mater. Also made this amazing documentary called "Finally Getting the News" about like Black workers, the Black Workers League in Detroit. Yeah. I didn't know that. I really wish we had recorded even more with him, but I'm so glad that we got
his life path is crazy.
Yeah.
In an amazing way.
Yeah. And next time we stream, we'll have to have some like photos of us from our trip. But for now, we're just going to show you. This is not the good quality that we'll obviously have from the documentary we're working on. And I'm so glad we got to meet him and some other amazing people, like Heather, who's this fascinating woman who didn't know that she was Jewish until her cousin did a DNA test. She grew up thinking that her grandfather left Germany just because like the family didn't want him indoctrinated in Nazism. It was really because they were Jews. And Rene like really helped her discover her identity and create an identity around being Jewish that's not, that's like a strong universalistic, solidaristic, anti-Zionist Jewish identity. And we also met through him someone named Nabil Sater, who is an amazing Lebanese American who it was through him that I went to the Peace Ball, which we still have to talk about in a Patreon. We'll go through those photos. And Ismail Noor, who is a Palestinian. They were all part of this coalition against genocide. Rene also lay down in traffic to protest the silence around Gaza. So
he gave us this like
newsreel film.
Historical documents about these like radical American film.
Yeah.
And he was also a very good painter There's a
That's what he got
ad for one of his gallery showings.
Yeah, that's what he got a Fulbright for, to paint. Yeah.
Just a very incredible individual that I would just feel really, really privileged to have spent any amount of time with him.
Yeah. So let's look at this clip of him.
So a lot of the population in the United States is completely ignorant, especially the Jewish community, the Jewish newspapers. I read some of that press, but the rabbis notice there's a few voices that speak up and talk about Jewish values. Now, I have to say, Jewish values are the ones that influenced me in my, so-called left wing, but also, other voices, Catholic Worker, Dorothy Day, people like that, those Christian social revolutionaries and stuff like that. So the rabbis don't say anything. And if you do say something, whether it's, Cornel West or Chris, some of these other voices, Chris Hedges, Norm Finkelstein, you get destroyed. You get destroyed in terms of your career, your job, your family. You can't do anything. I call it Jewish McCarthyism. If you know anything about McCarthyism, and I knew people who were the subjects of McCarthyism, who were blacklisted, et cetera, et cetera. So I knew people with, John Garfield and that family in New York, and others, Zero Mostel, and so that had a big influence. So I consider this Jewish McCarthyism, where you speak up, and in my case, I can say that because of my age and the fact that I'm retired, and so I don't care anymore. But when my last rabbi stood up and he said, "I stand for Israel," I just got so, which is very recent. Before that, he was standing up for Rashida Tlaib. Suddenly, he changed his tune.
Wow.
I stand for Israel. When all the rabbis were being pressured in Detroit to stand up for Israel, that's it. That was the litmus test. If you didn't, you're going to catch hell. That means your congregation, the people that give money to it's a money issue. It's your fundraisers locally. They would leave. Your congregation would splinter. I experienced that when Trump was elected. I belonged to a conservative synagogue at that time, and I realized that half of my friends who were socially progressive on the question of Palestine, they weren't so progressive.
Yeah, there's a term for that. It's called PEP, Progressive Except on Palestine.
Exactly, progressive except on Palestine. And when I realized that these friends were, pretty right-wing and pro-Trump and pro-Israel, I left that congregation because I realized that the rabbi would never say, in the next year or 4 years, would never say anything hostile to the present government. So, it leaves you kind of alone. But, that's the price. There's been other people, my role models, again, I feel like part of the, there's an international community of people that believe in social justice. And I was starting to talk about where my values come from. They come from doing, learning about the Old Testament, about the Jewish tradition. I always learn about, you care for the justice, you shall see.
Tikkun olam.
Tikkun olam. And you care about the widow and the orphan and the homeless. Those are the values that I believe in. Now, those are not the values of the right wing in Israel. As a matter of fact, the right wing, and there are some rabbis who've written about that, who are very right wing, and they say all this tikkun olam is baloney. They believe that the Jews belong on this land and nobody else does, and we're the most oppressed, and therefore, because of the Holocaust, we've been so oppressed that we can do anything and the world will not criticize us, so that when you think of European countries, they have such guilt still, including the Germans, about what they did, that they will not say a word against the Israeli leadership.
And they make Palestinians, though, pay for their crimes. The Germans do.
Exactly. Yes, they're able to, kind of transfer that guilt. But I think the issue today, I remember there was a period a couple of years ago where in Europe, suddenly the Jewish community was not being attacked as a scapegoat for various issues, but it was the immigrants, these Muslim Arab immigrants that were the enemy, and that's still the situation. The enemy in Europe is the foreigner, and that means the dark-skinned people, Africans, North Africans, etc. And so things have changed in Europe, but that's anti-foreign sentiment and right-wing equivalent. Israel right-wingers have allies in France and Italy, where they're also right-wing, also fascistic in terms of their views.
Well, thank you so much, Rene, for joining, and we'd love to have you back.
Thank you. Anytime. As things develop, I mean, it's not this. We're going through a period of change. Hopefully, they can. Anyway, it's hard to predict. Thank you very much.
Yeah. So that was Rene. That's him. I guess during COVID, he's wearing a face mask and he has a resist thing on his head. But yeah, that's him at the protest that he would organize. And we have lots of great stuff with him. Yeah,
I'm sure that we'll be able to share more.
Yeah. So, and that was, we met him, we visited him in October, and that was from when? When did that happen? Let me check. That was 9 months, April 9th, 2024. That's when we did that. When we did this virtual interview.
Yeah.
So,
just
may his memory be a blessing.
Yep, just sending all my best to all of his family and everyone who knew him. The world is definitely worse without him in it, but he touched so many people's lives that he's gonna live on a lot longer.
Yes. Yeah, we should do a show about him.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Okay, well, thanks everyone. Make sure you get as much quality time with your loved ones as possible. And keep on fighting for justice in Palestine. Because that's a good way to honor him.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Thanks everyone. Thanks Nate. Thanks Brad. Thanks Fenton.
Whoa.
My
bad.
Okay, that's okay. Is it done yet or no? Okay, we're still here. All right.
Yeah.
Thanks everyone. Thanks Brad. Thanks Nate. Thanks Phantom Fountain. Thanks everyone who tuned in, and thank you Greg and Andalusia and José Luis.
Okay, I'm down. You got rivers, man. You got rivers, man.